All right, so welcome everyone to our third safety day. So today we're going to be focusing on environmental health and safety. So we have a fairly small group of us joining us for the live session. So if you have any questions, just feel free to either pop them in the chat, raise your hand using the icon. Kim would love to answer your questions and kind of get to know you guys. So with that, if you could go to the next slide. So here in Saskatoon, we are gathering on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. If you're joining from another place in Canada, I encourage you to learn what treaty territory you are in right now. So today we have Kim Williams joining us to talk to us all about environmental health and safety. So Kim is currently the Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety, Regulatory and Security at Ovintiv Canada. She joined Ovintiv as a 19-year-old USask chemical engineering student and spent her early career learning the business from the ground up in a variety of engineering roles, including production, reservoir, development, facilities, and strategic planning. In 2010, she took on her first formal leadership role and was promoted again only 2 years later. As a newly minted senior manager, Kim helped her team navigate some of the Canadian oil and gas industry's darkest days. She led the Canadian operations portion of Ovintiv's portfolio transformation, accomplishing over $5 billion in property divestitures. In the next few years, she proved her combined talents for building teams and achieving results. And in 2019, she was named Encana's first ever female Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety, Regulatory Affairs and Security. In her free time, Kim serves as a principal oboist in 2 Calgary bands, both of which perform concerts in the community throughout the year. Kim and her husband Zane enjoy camping, traveling, scuba diving, and fishing together with their 2 dogs, Copper and Doug. So with that, if everyone could help me welcome Kim, if you can use the clap emoji or say welcome to Kim.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you for that. That's super gracious. Always great to be back with the U of S, the alma mater, and spend some time. I'm really looking forward to the presentation today. Just want to reiterate that love. If it's interactive, if you have questions along the way, please raise your hand or type them in the chat, and we'll try and address them as we go through here today. So just being an alumni of the U of S, I thought I'd throw a nice photo of me in with the E. I'm pretty sure it's still probably out front there of the engineering building. So that's back, the day that I got my job offer from Encana at the time, which is now Aventive, same company. Those are my brand new safety boots that I'm wearing, and we went out and took some photos with a bunch of folks who had gotten jobs at Encana at that time. So pretty cool memories, and love to be here today to talk to y'all. I always love to start with who am I, and what should you know about me, and all those sorts of things. And so I really like to talk to this slide of photos. And so you see lots of faces on here, but really my husband, who's in the military for about 20 years now, is currently in the Army side. He's a huge supporter of my career. He works from home with the military, and my sister and her husband are both accountants, U of S, and so they are a pretty strong duo. They do all my taxes. No, just kidding. They don't do my taxes. They won't. I won't pay them for that. But my mom and dad are still back in Prince Albert. They're doing really well. We're really looking forward to getting out on a big fishing trip this summer. We fished North Laurent at Neven Lake quite a bit. We've been going there since my parents were teenagers. And so really looking forward to getting out there this summer with them. The water is a big part of our lives. My husband's an ex-Navy diver, so we do a lot of scuba diving. We do a lot of boating. So a lot of our photos are around that, but we love to travel. And, some of our, the last trip that we took that was super, super memorable was we took a trip to Japan as part of a work event that I had. We stayed some extra time behind. My sister came over, just really spending quality time learning about new cultures is kind of our jam. So just give you an idea of who I am. All right, that's a big slide full of pictures, so it takes a second to switch. There we go. So most of you probably aren't familiar with Ovintiv, and I'll walk you through. So Ovintiv is really one of North America's oldest oil and gas producers. So multiple name changes over time, but really this company goes back to the days of the railways in Canada. So when the railways were built, the rail line needed water to help run the steam engines. And so moving across the country with the rail lines necessitated them drilling for water along the railway. Well, lo and behold, when they were drilling for water just outside of Medicine Hat back in 1883 at Langevin Siding, instead of finding water, they found natural gas, and pretty violent found natural gas. They expected to find water. All of a sudden, natural gas was rushing out of the wellbore. It ended up catching fire, burning the rig down, and a gentleman actually jumped off of the rig and broke his leg. And so I like to joke around that that's the beginning of safety at Ovintiv, was this poor gentleman who broke his leg jumping down from the rig in 1883. But that is the kind of the first natural gas well that was ever drilled in Alberta by our company. And so, over the years, we've merged, we've split, we've changed everything about ourselves. And you talked a little bit in the intro about the divestitures our company has done. We've had different assets in our company multiple times over the portfolio. So it's been a long history, but in January of 2020, right before the pandemic kind of hit, we rebranded the company from Encana Corporation to Ovintiv Inc. And we moved the company from Canada to the United States. And so most people are more familiar with our name Encana, or even before that, we were Pan-Canadian Petroleum and Alberta Energy Company merged to form Encana. So this is just a picture of that rig back in 1883, or an artist sketch. And this is a picture of that site today. So there's a really cool memorial cairn there, which has the story of what happened on that site. It's right next to the railway tracks, which you can see in the background. This is between Brooks and Medicine Hat. There's little signs off of the highway to get to this location. So it is a really historic site in Canada's history. So I've included this slide, not because I want to tell you all about Ovintiv and tell you what a great company we are, but what I want to really point out is that, as you start to think about environment, health, and safety in the context of a company, you have to think about it being one of the things that we monitor and measure performance on. And as you can see in our slide here, we start talking about our path forward as a company. And there's a number of items on here, and most of them are financially based. But you do see on here driving ESG progress. Well, what's ESG? It's environmental, societal, and corporate governance. So fitting inside of ESG is anything to do with safety performance, anything to do with employee health, employee hygiene and wellness, anything to do with emissions, air emissions, spills, water impacts. And so that's something that has become a tenet of our company, is really trying to show that we've got a great method of being able to really look after those items inside the company. And we'd like to take a leadership role in this space. It's something we're really proud of, is trying to make sure that people understand the work that we do in this space, because we can get painted with the brush of, oh, we're just an evil oil and gas company. Actually, it's not the case. I think you'd all be pretty surprised at some of the cool technology, innovation, and reductions in impact that we've been able to do over even the last number of years. And so it's something that we do trumpet our success when we get a chance. So what do I do as a VP of Environment, Health and Safety, Regulatory and Security? Well, I report to the Chief Operating Officer of our company, Greg Gibbons. I lead a really highly experienced team of 5 directors and a broader team of over 100 folks. And those folks are all over North America. So of my 5 directors, 1 is here in Calgary with me. I've got 3 in the Denver office, and I've got 1 down in an office in just north of Houston in a place called the Woodlands, Texas. Our folks in the field are in multiple US states, as well as in both Alberta and British Columbia here in Canada. So we're responsible really for the operating areas, so the different areas of the company, their safety performance, as well as their environmental performance. So we need to establish and deliver on our safety and environmental scorecard goals and metrics. As I talked about performance before, this is where it ties in. So every year the company sits down and sets goals. for our performance on safety and environmental matters. And I'll show you some of those a little bit later. But really, this team is focused on helping the operating areas achieve those goals. I do have a central team that's called the operational EH&S team, and they're focused on what I'm going to call Ethos implementation. We're going to talk a lot about Ethos here in a couple of slides, but basically it's our management system for how we operate as a company. We also have the security team, which is pretty cool. We of course have 3 large corporate offices where we have hundreds of folks working in buildings, so we do need to worry about physical security for those folks. We also have asset security, so we have a lot of high value assets out in the field that we need to maintain and keep an eye on out at our field sites. And then also from the perspective of, we even manage things like if we're having a meeting off site, we need to sweep the room, we need to do things and make sure that our folks are going to be secure and that that it's private for our use for business, for private business. So that's kind of a cool group that we look after. We also look after emergency response management. So if something does go catastrophically wrong out in the field, for example, if we have a large fire or explosion or something like that, we have centers that we open in each of our corporate offices where we manage those emergencies from. We have specific protocols that we follow and set guidelines that we follow as we go through emergency response. And thankfully, the amount of emergency response we do is pretty small. I think we had maybe 1 or 2 last year events, both of which were pretty minor. But it is something that if something very catastrophic were to happen, we have procedures in place to manage those. We also manage all of the key environmental liabilities and reclamation. So you probably hear in the news a lot about, in the oil and gas industry, they talk about the oil and gas industry having a lot of wells that need to be abandoned and well sites that need to be reclaimed. And sometimes they call these orphan sites. Well, a site doesn't get to be orphaned unless it's not owned by anyone. We have a lot of sites that we will have to eventually reclaim and abandon. And that's something that we manage ourselves on a yearly basis. And so we have a specific amount of money that we spend on this every year. And we're constantly working towards, reclaiming the land to the state that it was, or better than it was when we leave an area. So, when people talk about orphan wells, that's not what we do. We look after what we own, and then we also look after anything that we used to own if the company who has it now goes bankrupt, which happens quite often in Canada, to be honest. Business continuity is an interesting one that we have. So if you think about COVID, we had a huge business continuity challenge with COVID. So of course, having to work from home, making sure that we had the plans in place to be able to transition about 1,500 of our office staff to working from home across North America. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but you got to have the bandwidth, you got to have the server capacity, you got to have all these things in place so that on day one, everyone can connect and do their work in a way, in an uninterrupted way. And that was something that we spent a lot of time working on as a result of actually the 2013 floods that occurred in Calgary and in southern Alberta. We lost access to downtown for 2 weeks that year, and it caused us to put these business continuity plans in place so we could shift and be able to keep our business running completely without access to our corporate offices. So it came in super handy for the pandemic. On the environmental regulatory compliance side, as you can imagine, we have the duty to report and provide data and permits and applications to all the regulatory agencies across North America that we operate in, both provincially on a state level in the US, as well as federally in both Canada and the US. So it's an entire group within my area and a pretty big group of folks who maintain this compliance reporting across all teams. We assist in the development of our annual sustainability report. Our sustainability report is something we've been doing for, I think it's about 17 years at our company. So we report on every year on things such as our water usage, our emissions from our operations, just things, our safety statistics, things that people would be interested in to learn about our company from a sustainability perspective. The pandemic, of course, makes the list. That was a pretty big lift the last couple of years, really working through making sure we have the proper protocols in place and helping people work through, if they're a positive case, what do they do? And did they have any close contacts at work, and who do we need to notify? And so that was all something that we had to develop on the fly, and we've been able to maintain here for the last couple of years. And then lastly, providing, updates, strategic planning and results back to what I call the COO table, the Chief Operating Officer table, as well as our executive leadership team and the EH&S committee of the board of directors. So we do have quarterly updates with every single one of those groups. With the COO table, it's more often, it's about once a week. And so that it does take up a large chunk of our time as well. So I think the next slide is pretty cool though. This is like, what does it actually look like to do this job? Well, honestly, it's a lot of being out and talking to folks. And so it's, working with folks in the field, being out in the field, getting exposure to what we're doing, sitting in meetings, absolutely, doing presentations, going on business trips. We have a significant business partner with Mitsubishi Corporation in Japan. And so we do spend a lot of time in Japan talking to their management team. Also, we spend a lot of time in the field taking our executive team on tours, taking our board of directors on tours at least once a year. And really, we like to do volunteer events with our folks in the field and provide support to our communities. So it's all kind of ties together, but really, myself personally, I have an office here in Calgary, one in Denver and one in the Woodlands. So I do split my time between those three places. With COVID, it's been a little hit and miss, but really this job looks like spending a lot of face time in a lot of places with as many people as you can to get to know about them. So I promised you a little bit more on Ethos, and this is where it starts. So what the heck is Ethos again? Well, Ethos is our operations management system. And so basically this is a framework that clearly states how we will conduct our business. And it allows us to systematically manage operational risks. And so you see on the left side here, just kind of a responsibility matrix of how it works right from the top, from our board of directors, our president and CEO, Brenda McCracken, really starts with company-wide policies, practices, and guidelines. So that can be really high-level things like our business code of conduct practice. How will we all act as workers here at Ovintiv? Then it starts to trickle down into the EH&S committee, which is a special committee of the board of directors of about 6 board members who steward particularly the EH&S team and the executive leadership team, and they are responsible for the Ethos management system. So then we get down into operational EH&S, which is a group in my team, which maintains all the standards and guidance documents. Now, Ethos has 12 standards, and no, I probably couldn't name them all off the top of my head, but if we think about some of the more important ones, I would talk about things like we have an audit standard, which defines how many times a year do we go out and look at our operations and audit for things that we want to make sure that we see in our operations. That's a good example of one. Then we work our way down into practices, which each of our operations, EH&S directors and managers are responsible for. So those practices really document what roles and responsibilities and requirements folks have within the overall standards. So if you think about something like a personal protective equipment practice, so that would state that every single person who works in the field at Ovintiv has to have steel-toed boots, has to have a hard hat, has to have some sort of flame retardant coveralls or shirt and pants, and then has to have ear protection when appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. A mask during COVID is another good example of that one. And then we're down to operating area leadership procedures. So those are particular procedures for at site. So for example, this pump at this site, this is how it gets started up and shut down. That's kind of the level of a procedure. So, this system works from having the framework 12 standards, and then everything else gets more detailed as you go down. And that's kind of how we do it at the bottom of the structure. We like to use the little icon here, plan, do, check, and act. It's kind of the tenet of Ethos, is that you plan the work, you do the work, you check to make sure that things kind of worked out as you expected. And if not, then you act, and around you go, back to replanning, doing, checking, and acting. So it's just that really I call it the front to back of doing any good project. And as engineers, you all know that any project has more to it than just doing the design. You have to actually do, figure out how it went at the back end and then make any tweaks for next time. So something I really wanted to talk a little bit about here today was the safety pyramid and the hierarchy of control. So this is a really old school dude, Herbert Heinrich, in 1931 came up with this idea that for every 300 unsafe acts that you see out at work, there's an equivalent 29 minor injuries and 1 serious injury or fatality. So what does this tell you? This tells you that if you can manage unsafe acts really well, then you can reduce the number of unsafe acts, and that will reduce the number of minor injuries that you have and will reduce the number of serious injuries or fatalities that you'll have. And so, of course, as you go up that pyramid, you've got, higher and higher risk and higher implications of an incident. An unsafe act might be something as simple as I saw a hammer on the ground, I stepped over it instead of picking it up, to all the way up to fatality where someone is killed as a result of a workplace incident. And I can tell you, I've seen everything on this pyramid, and Herbert Heinrich's methodology here really holds true, is that the more unsafe acts you see in an operation, the more chance there is and the more likelihood there is that you're going to end up with something really serious happening down the line. And so, we look at what are the indicators of an incident that's going to happen. And those unsafe acts allow you, we use those as leading indicators. So we call, we'll do things called hazard identifications, where, if someone's out on a work site, they see that hammer lying on the ground, they write it up as a hazard identification, pick up the hazard, put it away. But it allows everyone to talk about it. Hey, I saw this on site yesterday. And so now someone else is looking on their work site for similar, or, next time they see something, they're going to do something about it. So really we use those as leading indicators of safety risk. A near miss. What's a near miss? Well, near miss are those ones where you're like, just missed her by an inch. So I like to think of these on our rigs, on our drilling rigs particularly. We've got folks working at height up in the derrick. You've got machinery moving around the floor, around where people are working. You've got pipe being handled that's, up to 50 meters long in the derrick. And it's all being handled up above people's heads sometime. Well, one of the biggest things we face is something getting dropped, and we call it a drops event. When something gets dropped and folks are working in the zone where that gets dropped, nine times out of 10, you get that, just lucky someone didn't get hit by that falling object. Well, that's a near miss. And so, you have to treat those very seriously and look into the root causes of what's occurred there. So, we basically do root cause analysis on anything at a near miss and above at Ovintiv. So we break it down to what is the actual, triggering event that led this to occur, and how can we, put together some corrective actions to keep it from happening again. And so when you really think about that pyramid and how it works, the right-hand side of the slide shows 10 life-saving rules. So if you think about what are the 10 things, if we focused on the most, that we could use that would really help us prevent these incidents from occurring. These are the 10 that industry has come up with. And this is a Energy Safety Canada thing. All oil and gas companies in Canada have adopted this standard. The US is very similar. I think they have 9, but Canada has number 10. I think in Canada is the fit for duty one. I think the US is getting there on fit for duty, but just not quite there. So you think about these, fit for duty. Okay, so be in a state to perform work safely. Okay, well, that makes sense, right? If you think about this from a perspective of alcohol and drug, you think about this from the perspective of mental health, you think about this from the perspective of sleep, think about it from the perspective of, eating right and being physically fit for the job that you need to do. And, people joke around about this a lot, but in parts of the US where our operations are 90% of the year operate in very hot and dry conditions, heat stress is one of the largest issues that we see. And fit for duty, part of fit for duty in that area is maintaining hydration, taking breaks in the cooling trailer that we actually have to make sure that you can maintain fit for duty across the entire shift and not collapse from heat exhaustion when you finished your shift for the day. And I see someone saying, ask the 5 whys. Yeah, that's a really good point about, who, where, what, why, when. Absolutely, when you're investigating incidents, that's what you want to go through. Think about some of these other ones. Let's talk about hot work. Okay, so as engineers, this is something that you're probably gonna, have come up in your career. So work that's being done around flammables and ignition sources, or, welding is a good example of this. Working around things that have ignition sources is tricky when you're working with hydrocarbons, because of course you can have something happen so fast without even thinking about it. I'll give you an example. So in December, we had a pumping unit working on a well down in Utah. And so they were pumping fluid down the well and they were recirculating it back up the casing side of the well. So the well has a pipe in it, they're pushing it down the pipe and it's coming up the outside of the pipe. Well, they had thought that they had closed the valve on the outside, but the problem was the valve was actually frozen and they didn't realize it. And so they thought it was closed, but it was actually just frozen in the open position. And so eventually when they were pumping, all of a sudden hydrocarbon gas started coming out of the casing side. And the truck that was pumping down the unit was parked about 25 feet away from the wellhead. Well, when the hydrocarbon gas started coming out, it got over to the truck, and the truck was pumping heated fluid. So it had an external fired heater on the truck. Well, and of course, the hydrocarbon cloud next to that heater was a spark for that cloud of hydrocarbon gas, and we had an explosion. And that's something that we have a very strict policy on distance, that you need to be away from the wellhead when you're performing what we'd call hot work. And it was violated in this case. They should have been about double the distance away that they were parked. And so this is just how fast it can happen. You have someone draining a simple vessel, on a separator package, and a little bit of gas comes out. If there's any way that can spark, static discharge even is enough to do it, you can have a flash fire in a second. And so these are all, these life-saving rules are in place because they are very key things that if you look after, then safety will look after itself. I think the other one I would give an example of is working at height. So, we've all climbed up the ladder and hung the Christmas lights, or, inspected the roof, but really fall protection is just such a crucial element that most people forget about. When you climb that ladder, do you have the 3 points of contact? Do you have a fall protection once you're up at height? And when you're descending from height, do you have that contact in a way to prevent yourself from falling if you slip? And so that's a pretty crucial one as well in our industry. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor for the life-saving rules. So how does this all look when you talk about performance? Well, one of the things that we monitor here at Ovintiv is called total recordable injury frequency. So what does that mean? That means the amount of injuries that you have in a year divided by the number of hours that you worked gives you a frequency of injury per hours worked. And this is an industry standard definition that's put out in Canada by CAP, in the US by multiple places, API, XPC, lots of different councils for energy safety and production. But really, we talk about TRIF as a measure of our success on recordable injuries, because of course, if your frequency of recordable injuries is lower and lower, that means you're having less of them per unit of hours worked. And so you can see we've been able to really reduce the amount of recordable injury frequency we've had at the company from pretty big number, 1.7 back in 2003, down to 2021. We just ended 2021 with a 0.15 TRIF. And so what's good here? Well, the Energy Safety Canada, so the Canadian oil and gas standard in 2020 for TRIF was about a 0.40. And on the US side, it was about a 0.66. And so, we have very good safety performance compared to our peers. And what do I credit this to is something I've highlighted in orange on the slide. You see a couple of things. You see the safety essential for leaders implementation. We're going to talk a little bit about this. This is a course that we implemented back in 2009. 2009, came after a few very, very tough years on safety performance. We'd had a number of fatalities in 2008. 2013 was the date of the last fatality we've had at our company. But really, we wanted to kind of reset the bar for safety performance expectations. And so we created a course with Global Safety Canada on teaching safety leadership. And this is something that's really important for all of you in engineering, because if you don't expect it, you will be a safety leader on the sites that you go on, in the designs that you provide, in the work that you do. You'll be expected to think with your safety mind first. Now, where does that come from? Well, that comes from your obligation as an engineer to protect the public above all else. And so there will be this obligation of you to understand where your performance is and to ensure that it's your first priority in any of the work that you do. And so safety leadership is something that you can learn. It's an amazing course where we teach folks how to interact on work sites and really help people develop safety culture at a high level. So what I mean by that is like making sure that you are not just speaking the right things, but you actually walk the talk when you're out on the work site, when you're in the office, that it's safety above all else, and everyone knows that. That's your core expectation. So it's pretty interesting. We've been putting that course on since 2009. We've put almost 5,000 people through that course during that time. And I would say it is a key element of our success and really speaks to why culture is really important as well. And I think there was a session on that earlier this week for you guys too. So that kind of brings me to risk assessment. Is a really core principle here that I've been kind of hinting at a little bit along the way. But how do you do risk assessment? Well, good news is that it's quite prescriptive, and this might be hard for you to see, but I'll walk you through how do we do risk assessment at Ovintiv. Well, first off, kind of step one, you start with evaluating the consequence of the risk to different categories. So what's the consequence to health and safety? What's the consequence to the environment? What's the health and consequence to the asset and to the regulatory body? And so you go through and you read the different categories and you basically choose, is it a minor consequence, a moderate, a serious, or a critical consequence? So what does that mean? Let's just take one example. So to health and safety, a critical consequence would be a fatality, a long-term health impact, a life-threatening or life-altering injury, or evacuation of a community. For us, that would be a critical health and safety consequence. Whereas a minor health and safety consequence may be a first aid injury, which is, you cut your finger, you walk down the hallway to the box and you grabbed a Band-Aid, or an illness, a manageable illness. So then we move over, once we've got the consequence figured out, we need to figure out what's the likelihood of the occurrence next. And so that really moves anywhere from rare to unlikely to likely to common. And so basically you take each risk that you identify and you give it this consequence and occurrence. And for us, we define a common occurrence as expected to occur several times during the life cycle of an operation or a facility, whereas a rare is remote or extremely remote chance of occurring. And we give some examples. 1 time in 100 years is a rare. 50 times per year or 25 to 100% chance is a common. So once you have those two ratings, you've got a number and a letter, you go over to this matrix and you basically look it up. So let's say we had a risk that was critical risk, so could result in a fatality, but the chance of it occurring is rare. And so that would put us in this, medium blue color of risk level. And then you'd go down to this table and look at that risk level. Well, that's a medium risk level. It says complete assessed activity in this target risk zone. So for what that means is you can go ahead with whatever it is that you see as the risky thing that you need to do. However, you're going to really you're going to have to keep on top of that activity. And if it changes at all from what your plan is, then you'll have to reassess. Of course, when you get into the high and yellow and extreme risks, you get to a place where you have to stop and reduce that risk to at least a medium in order to keep moving. And you cannot proceed if it's in the red. It's just period. You got to find a different way to do the work. You got to find a different way to do the task. And then the last step is take action. You know, you can do risk assessments till you're blue in the face, but what matters is that you take action on them. And so we have an online system where you can do a risk assessment from your phone. You can do it out in the field. You can do it in the office. But really, at the end of the day, it's a tool in the toolbox that allows folks to sit down and discuss jobs and take a course of action that's safe for everyone, and everyone agrees to the course of action before setting out to do the work. And so when you think about, well, what if you get to this high, and what do? Well, what you do is you look at this hierarchy of controls and you say, how can I control this risk by using one of these things? And so, can I use elimination? Can I physically remove that hazard by doing something different? Can I replace the hazard with something that's less dangerous? Can I use engineering controls? Can I isolate people from the hazard? So think of this like a guard on a grinder. That's an engineering control. Can I use an administrative control? Can I change the way people work so they're not exposed to the risk? And then lastly, we talk about personal protective equipment. Last line of defense is personal protective equipment. So how can I protect the worker with personal protective equipment? Should be your last option, really, as you work your way down this reverse pyramid. And so I'll give you an example of this with COVID, actually, because it's pretty timely. And was something that we did is we developed our COVID protocols. So this is our poster where we advertise, how are we going to keep everyone safe at work and what our protocols are. So we talk about it's the sum of the actions that keep everyone safe and the multiple layers of protection to help reduce the risk of transmission. So when you look at a work environment here in the office in Calgary or wherever it is, and a good elimination example for COVID risk is that we'll comply with the jurisdictional orders, we'll follow our visitor protocols, we'll obey our catering protocols, we'll encourage folks to get vaccinated, and we'll perform post-exposure testing. So that's trying to eliminate the hazard on our sites. So for example, if we perform testing on someone who's been exposed to COVID-19, then we know if they have COVID or not at that time when we tested them. So we were able to eliminate the hazard in the moment. Another good example here on the engineering side was a really big lift from my team, was doing an assessment of all of our ventilation systems, not in only our major offices, but in all of our field locations and buildings. And take this down to every single trailer, doghouse, porta potty that we have out on our sites, making sure that we had the right air filters and air exchanges per hour in all of our buildings to try and slow down the virus. Also setting up physical barrier partitions, all of our front desks in all of our major buildings, attaching floor decals in our high traffic areas. So for example, when you come into our building here to get into the elevators, there's some queuing areas where there's some dots set up for you to stand on to make sure we maintain social distancing. And then sanitation stations, which I'm sure everyone sees everywhere, but we have them in some key locations. So those are engineered controls that we can apply to manage COVID risk. On the administrative side, we think about things from the perspective of, we developed a self-screening tool in-house, just a simple Microsoft Forms form that every morning everyone fills out on their cell phone, a list of 7 questions on, do you have any symptoms? Have you been in close contact with anyone? Are you being tested for COVID? Just trying to give everyone a chance every day to give some real thought to, do I have symptoms? Do I have a sore throat? Do I feel a little sick? Just trying to make sure that everyone takes that thoughtful, second to, before they come into the office every day. We also have a policy, of course, of staying home if you're sick of any sickness, following our meeting room protocols, which are different depending on which location you're in, and then social distancing, and also inspecting offices is something that we do as well. On the substitution side of things, you think about, we used to just use whatever for cleaning supplies. We actually went to the EPA approved cleaning supplies for COVID to improve the effectiveness of our process and minimize COVID transmissions. We also substituted a lot of our meetings in person to virtual meetings during the pandemic. And then lastly, personal protection. So our masking policy that we have across all of our offices, as well as, some of our field locations actually have the use of N95s as well as respirators, depending on the work that they're doing. So that's kind of our last line of defense, but it's a great example of, we call it the Swiss cheese model, really using all these layers together to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And, people ask, well, how do we do on this? And I can tell you that since the beginning of the pandemic, we have had zero transmission of COVID-19 on any of our work sites across North America. And that's pretty amazing because not all of our peers have been able to say that. And a lot of them, unfortunately, have camp environments, specific sites. We're more spread out, absolutely. But it is something that we worked really hard at and have these controls across all of our sites. And, we think that it made the difference. And so I think it's another good example too of managing a risk to an acceptable level. So, something we were talking about before everyone got into the room, but we've actually been back in the office since June of 2020. And so we only left the office for about 3 weeks, and then we were back in with protocols in place. And a lot of other companies downtown here in Calgary are still not back, and they're struggling with how to get their folks back and how to bring them back in a safe way. And they ask us how we've done it. I think the biggest benefit that we've seen from having one together, and I'm sure a lot of you feel this way too, is we get so much more collaboration, innovation, cool ideas, creative solutions when we have everyone together. And we just get so much more, creative work. And so it's something we really focused hard on with our executive team, was how we could get the right protocols in place so that we could have everyone here safely. All right, so my little soapbox speech here on leadership, give you a little bit here on leadership matters most. And this is something that you are all going to be called upon as engineers to do, is to think about, do you follow the rules because you have to, or do you follow the rules because you want to? And this is the base of the DuPont-Bradley curve. So this takes you from the left side, where you're really reactive and you do safety because you have to, all the way to the other side, where you're internally motivated and you have a commitment to follow the rules because you want to, and you help others get there. You're a networker and you care for others. And that's really something, this is the basis of our Safety Essentials for Leaders course, is trying to get folks from the left side of this curve to the right side of this curve. So getting them through from being really reactive and just living in the moment to being completely interdependent with others and understanding that we all affect each other's performance. That's one of the biggest learnings I've had as an engineer, I would say, in my career, is that you can be great at what you do individually, but when you work on a job site with other folks, it's what you do together that really matters, and how you're going to be judged in your performance relies on how others perform as well, and how you help them perform. And that, that's not necessarily something that we're used to when we come up through the academic system of being judged on your own performance independently a lot of the time. So it is a really, really core piece of what I've learned over the years, is safety leadership matters more than anything else when you're trying to develop good team culture. So just a bit on performance, how does this look? Well, this is the scorecard that my company uses to measure safety performance. So we talk about things like recordable injuries, total recordable injury frequency, the number of process safety events that we have. So that's when things get outside of containment, basically. So if we have gas get outside of a pipeline, or we have oil get outside of a tank, that's a process safety event, because that stuff's supposed to be inside the process. High potential events, so that's those like almost gotchas, that's the pipe dropping to the floor and not hitting anybody. Serious injuries are one that have a severity greater than a certain standard. So a serious injury would be something pretty serious, like an entire hand being amputated, or a compound fracture, or burn or significant burns, those would be serious injuries. Motor vehicle incidents is, anytime we have an at-fault accident at there's particular boundaries on that, but it's basically a high rate, high impact accident in a motor vehicle. And then serious events is just the summation of process safety events, hypos, serious injuries, and motor vehicle incidents. And so we talk every time I get in front of my boss, we talk about these things, and we have targets for the year that we are trying to achieve. And then we color this thing red and green, depending on how we're doing. Sometimes it's yellow if we're close to how we're doing. So last year, we did great on recordable injuries. We had 29 versus 39 the year before. So we injured 10 less people at Ovintiv last year, which is a significant achievement. Our TRIF was 0.15, which is very, very low compared to industry. Our serious events was up year over year. So we got a red on that. And well, what happened there? Well, you can see that in 2021, we had a lot more process safety events than we did in 2020. And the majority of this was down in our asset in North Dakota. We had a lot of problems with tanks and tank fires in North Dakota. And as it turned out, we did have some burner malfunction issues and a whole set of tanks that had been delivered. And so it's a pretty cool engineering problem, actually, to realize that all of these fires were connected by these malfunctioning heaters. And so, when you start to investigate incidents, you sometimes uncover these engineering, basis to these issues. On the environmental performance side of things, it matters just as much as the safety stuff. We talk to spills, we talk to spill intensity, which is how much you spilled divided by how much you produced on the liquid side. We have significant spills, which are anything more than 10 barrels spilled at one time. We also monitor how much we flare and vent. We also monitor our methane intensity. So how many metric tons of methane did we emit during the year divided by our total production? It's an intensity metric. And so we were green across the board on the environmental side in 2021, and you can see the significant improvements over the 2020 numbers. But these are the sorts of things that you'll be asked to know about and to understand and to, think about. If you're the facilities engineer, let's say, responsible for designing the equipment on a new site, well, you need to understand what impact that's going to have to potentially the methane intensity of the company. Because if you're adding a design that is, super cheap, but has lots of emissions, then that might be something the company is not willing to tolerate. And that's the push and pull of cost and emissions and environmental and safety performance. There's always that tension that you have to manage. So it's something that you'll probably be exposed to in your careers. So when we look at, how are we doing on performance? This is something that I added from last year's comments, was that thinking about our different metrics that we talk about, how are we doing as a company? Well, we feel really good about how we're doing. Like I said, we've been sustainability reporting for 17 years as a company. 7th safest year in 2020, happy to report we were 8th safest year in 2021. But these are the kinds of things that at the end of the year, they end up on our corporate scorecard. And our corporate scorecard is used to determine things like, does everyone get a bonus for their 2021 performance? So this performance can impact your financial bottom line as an individual. And so that's where the tie is. If you can have better performance, you might get more of a reward at the end of the year. Or if you did worse year over year, then you can expect that to affect your reward. If you're in the executive team at the company, if this performance is poor, it can affect your salary. It can affect everything that you take home on a personal basis from the company. And so every single person at our company has their performance tied to our safety and environmental performance. And so I think it's, something that maybe people misunderstand the relationship here. And I just wanted to clarify it a little bit. So lastly, I just wanted to talk to kind of the wish I had knowns. I'm going to hit just a couple of these, but really, you're going to be the big E, the big engineer on site, but you really have to have a lot of creativity. You have to understand and seek to understand. I call it inquisitiveness, but in a humble way. Really helping build trust by demonstrating teamwork to folks and helping others, because there's going to be folks that you need to really teach you things early in your career. And you're not going to be the first new grad engineer that they've ever seen, and it can be a grind for them to have to teach someone, to have them move on every time. So building trust with folks is going to be a challenge if they know that you're going to be moving on in a couple of years. I think allies across all disciplines, probably one of the things I didn't know that was going to be so important. Some of the recommendations that have been made for me to move up in my career, those recommendations have come from folks that I didn't work directly with on a day-to-day basis. The chief financial officer spoke very highly of me, which allowed me to have this position I have now. It's not something I ever would have equated back when I was in school, for sure. And I think lead from any chair you sit in is a good one. So show that safety leadership, show that willingness to have an open culture. You can influence that from any chair in the organization. And the last one I talk about is eat whatever's put in front of you. You can't stress this enough. Every assignment you get is not going to be perfect or what you want, but what matters is what you do with it. And if you really eat that plate, I call it the plate of spaghetti in front of you, you can really show that it doesn't matter what challenge you're given, you're going to persevere and do your best with it. And that's what folks are looking for. So that's really my prepared material. I think we've got a few minutes for questions here, Michelle.
Yeah, so if students want to pop their questions into the chat. We have a few questions that came in for the registration, so I'll maybe start with those and we'll see if students have any other questions.
Perfect.
So the first one, I thought this one was pretty interesting. What happens if an engineer signs off on a project they believe to be safe, but in reality isn't?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, for sure. So I think it's one of those things, if a design is done and then it's shown to be unsafe in practice, it can come all the way back to the design and the designer. And so when you stamp an authenticated document in a design as being done in accordance with the provincial standard or wherever you work, then you are taking ultimate responsibility for that design. And so if it was you designed it, but they built it different, that there would be an accommodation there. But if it's, you designed something and it was unsafe, it unfortunately is your responsibility as the PE.
Great answer. Another question. Where do we find changes to occupational health and safety regulations?
Yeah, for sure. So occupational health and safety in Canada is run on a provincial basis. So if you search for EH&S, Saskatchewan or Alberta or whatever province you're looking for, you should be able to get the latest regs right off their website. It will be part of your PEng exam. We'll be understanding those regulations. So definitely look that up when you have time.
All right. And again, if anyone has questions, pop up your hands or put them in the chat. Oh, here is a question from a student. How much is practically possible as an oil company to adhere to the green norms? How environmental health is taken care of?
So that's a good question too. Absolutely practically possible. And so, most oil and gas companies now are at a place where this environmental focus is front and center. Our company, for example, we set a methane intensity target for the company 2 years ago that we were going to reduce methane intensity by 33% by 2025. Our company is kind of the sort that we like to overachieve. And so we actually ended up achieving that goal last year instead of 2025. And we're literally on the verge of setting some greenhouse gas emissions targets, which are very significant reductions in our emissions by 2030 and a plan to get there. And I think that's the biggest thing I would say is that, really looking to the industry to put some plans behind some of these statements that are more aspirational that they've released in the past. And it's something that our company has really worked hard at is we don't want to put a goal out there until we have a plan to get there. And that's why we've waited and we're going to put that out this year. But it is possible to get there on a lot of our operations. And then I think the last thing you'll see in the industry is the offset market on greenhouse gases is going to be part of the solution over time as well. You know, buying GHG offsets to offset stuff that we can't, you know, we produce a carbon-based product, we can't 100% eliminate our emissions, but we can get to a net zero basis on, you know, with those offsets in place as well.
That's great. I think the really cool thing about engineering is it's not a stagnant job. You know, it's always working to try to improve and change. So that's really, really great to hear that you guys are such leaders in your industry.
Yeah, it's been a big change. Yeah.
So another question, this came in through the registrations. On a work site, about how often do the safety rules get broken? I've heard of bending rules in the name of productivity, among other things, which isn't really excusable.
That's a great point. Absolutely. So how often do they get broken? I would say it's not about them being broken on purpose 99% of the time. It's generally a distracted moment or just an honest mistake 99% of the time. I was walking across location. I was thinking about what I'm going to eat for dinner. I missed the pothole. I slipped. I rolled my ankle and it broke. Right? Like that's probably more what you see. You know, someone violating something on purpose to speed up a job. You know, that's something that we really worked hard to root out. It does happen out there in industry, but that's where the leadership comes in, is having, you know, yourself or whoever's managing that job to have that consistent message time after time. Hey gang, safety is number one, not schedule. I'll always take a schedule, you know, deficiency over a safety injury, and just being consistent time after time so that people are absolutely clear who work on your sites that it's above all else safe than anything else. And we always say that if you can't do the job safely, it shouldn't be done at all. We all say that. If you went down the hall here and asked 10 leaders, they would all tell you that. And it's building that culture inside the company to do that. And if you're working in a company that's not doing that, then you have to ask yourself if you're comfortable inside of that culture. I personally wouldn't be, but I totally, you know, it's something you do have to ask yourself.
It's really interesting because that ties in so much to Monday's session about safety culture.
Yeah.
So
sure.
The final question, is there a common area where safety is typically overlooked or needs to have a higher consideration of safety than it generally does?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, we like to talk about that in terms of areas that have higher safety risk. And, you know, in our operations, I like, you know, anything that we have in Canada, most of our operations here in the Montney in Alberta and British Columbia do have a high level of sour gas in them, so hydrogen sulfide gas in them. And so our standards, practices, protocols at the field level are a level above what they are anywhere else, because there is zero room for error. Folks have to be under supplied breathing air anytime you're talking about breaking the process. There's just, you know, you do way more planning and a lot more risk assessment than you do in an area that's 100% sweet, low pressure gas. And so, yeah, absolutely. You have to kind of turn up the dial for higher risk, and you can turn it down for lower risk. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today and talking to us about environmental health and safety. I know I really enjoyed your presentation, and I hope everyone else learned as much as I did. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. It was so good to talk to everyone, and everyone stay healthy.